sometimes things just get so bad that the downside of going into therapy, taking the time, making the trip, paying the money, and digging up those nasty feelings, the downside of all of that is better than the downside of not doing anything and continuing to struggle. So, we grit our teeth and make the call, set up an appointment, and come in. And pretty much, we are in crisis. And so the beginning of therapy is really mostly about disburdening ourselves of the massive confusion and chaos and anguish that happens to fill our lives in that moment. And if we're lucky, we find a therapist who's a good fit, somebody who gets us and can help us, we get through the crisis, we lay out our feelings, get to think about the situation, develop a few strategies, and move on with our lives. And for lots of us, I think, that's the beginning and the end of the treatment process. Short, quick, to the point, and we move on. And if we can do that, that's great. It's minimal expense, minimal inconvenience, maximal benefit, and problem solved. And in fact, I think there are problems in our life which are largely circumstantial, which if we can get some help in sorting out, we can navigate through and figure it out and move on with our lives. Sometimes, however, the problems we bump into today have to do not just with circumstance. In fact, I don't think they ever have only to do with circumstance, but have largely to do with aspects of ourselves which we haven't worked out. And so the problem we're having today may, at first glance, look unique, but at second glance, or third, or fourth, appear to take on familiar contours. And so we begin to recognize the outlines of a pattern, and that can help us begin to know that we are coming into contact with a deeper part of ourselves. And when that occurs, the opportunity of therapy is beyond the immediate problem at hand, but deeper, more systemic. The opportunity is to understand something more fundamental about ourselves so that we can get a clearer sense of what's happening as it's happening today, because we have an awareness of how it's happened yesterday, or last month, or last year, or last decade. And with that greater awareness, avoid those familiar traps and be more skillful in how we navigate our lives. Now, often we develop the patterns we do because of certain events that have happened that have been difficult, sometimes traumatic, and have left us with some very hard feelings too hard, too painful to know about. And so we very intuitively and instinctively, naturally and unconsciously set them aside. Sometimes there are patterns of relationship, let's call them dynamics of relationship, which took a certain shape, seemed just the way it was at the time, often with our parents, of which we were unaware as specific configurations, but which on inspection turn out to take a very particular shape. And these dynamics too can leave us with all kinds of feelings about ourselves, sometimes feelings of shame, sometimes feelings of guilt, sometimes feelings of anger, feelings which, again, can be too difficult to know about in their origins, even if they echo in the feelings we find ourselves experiencing in our relationships with other people today. And so, if we bump into these deeper patterns, these systemic qualities of ourself when we go into therapy because we've got a crisis to solve, we may decide to stick around for a while because there are deeper parts of ourself to find out about, deeper pools of feelings to reclaim. And so one way to think about the process of psychotherapy is as a reclamation project of the self. That is to say that we want to reclaim those parts of ourself which we have left deep underground, like hidden well springs of feeling, but well springs which are too toxic for us to know about and process. And so we might choose to enter into therapy in order to remediate these toxic pools of feeling so that we can then have those parts of ourself to ourself, and instead of be divided from parts of ourself, we can in fact be more whole. And so one might say that the process of therapy, when it comes to this reclamation, is the process of expanding our consciousness of ourselves, and in so doing, our awareness of our feelings, which permits us then to feel them and to think about them, and then to take those thoughts and use them as the basis for how we act as we move forward in the world. If we can do this, if we can reclaim these hidden well springs of ourself, then we have a much greater sense of integration and a much greater feeling of wholeness. And out of this feeling of wholeness comes a sense of flow. That is to say that we can move fluidly within the territory of ourself because we are not moving around these toxic well springs, even unconsciously, because they are no longer toxic. And so we have a sense of integration, of wholeness, and of flow within ourselves. Once we achieve that sense of flow in ourselves that arises out of this experience of internal connection, then it's quite likely that we will begin to feel a connection with the world outside of ourselves. We're no longer hidden from ourselves. We feel full and whole and fluid, and we are therefore more receptive to the world that exists around us. And so we begin to feel more connected to other people, and we begin to feel more connected to other living things. In fact, we might even begin to feel more connected to the world and to the solar system and eventually to the universe as a whole, part of a huge expansion of being. And that feeling of expansiveness, that sense of flow within and connection without, even a flow between ourselves as individuals and everything else that is, that sense of expansiveness affords a feeling of joy. If, as has been said, suffering grows out of a false sense of separateness, one might say that joy arises out of a true sense of connection. And this experience of connection within and without, flow from the deepest interior part of oneself to the farthest external expanse of the cosmos, one might say that that experience constitutes a feeling of spiritual connection. And so one might say that at best, psychotherapy that begins with a crisis can end in a spiritual feeling of wholeness, of expansion, of consciousness, of inclusiveness, and of joy.